Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in turn of the century American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that shocked an entire city, where a seemingly respectable landlady defied all moral boundaries and left a legacy so horrifying that the building itself was torn down to erase the memory. It was the year 1902. The United States was emerging from the Gilded Age, basking in industrial triumph and territorial expansion. President Theodore Roosevelt occupied the White House. The nation was still mourning the assassination of President McKinley just months before, and cities across America were swelling with immigrants seeking fortune in the New World. In Indianapolis, Indiana, the situation was prosperous on the surface. The capital city had transformed from a frontier town into a bustling urban center, its streets lined with electric streetcars, its factories churning out everything from automobile parts to pharmaceuticals. The population had doubled in 2 decades, reaching over 160,000 souls. Among them were thousands who had arrived with little more than hope, seeking work, seeking shelter, seeking the promise that America had whispered to the tired and poor. But beneath the gleaming facade of progress, in the narrow streets of the working-class neighborhoods, darkness had been accumulating. On South California Street, number 630, stood a three-story brick boarding house that appeared unremarkable. Its windows reflected the gaslight glow of evening. Its door opened to those who could pay modest rent. Its landlady smiled warmly at prospective tenants. No one suspected that beneath their feet, in the cool darkness of the basement, 23 human beings lay buried. Indianapolis in the early 1900s was a city of contrasts, a place where millionaires built mansions along Meridian Street, while factory workers crowded into boarding houses that lined industrial districts. The air carried the smell of coal smoke and progress, the sound of hammering and ambition. Horse-drawn carriages still competed with the occasional automobile, and the night watchman's call echoed through streets lit by the new electric lamps that the city had only recently installed. South California Street sat in a neighborhood that developers called transitional, a polite term for a district where the working poor lived in modest homes divided into smaller and smaller units to accommodate the endless stream of newcomers. Here lived the laborers who worked at the nearby stockyards, the seamstresses who squinted over their work in dim tenement rooms, the elderly pensioners surviving on savings that dwindled with each passing month. The boarding house at 630 South California Street was typical of its kind. Built in the 1880s, it had started as a single-family home before being converted to accommodate multiple tenants. 3 stories of red brick, narrow windows with white trim, a small front porch where residents could sit on humid summer evenings. The front parlor had been converted to the landlady's private quarters. The upper floors contained 8 rooms for rent, furnished simply with iron bedsteads, washstands, and wooden chairs. The kitchen in the rear served as a common area where tenants could prepare simple meals if they wished. And below, accessible through a door off the kitchen, stone steps descended into the basement, a space that most tenants never entered, a realm of shadows and dampness that the landlady insisted she would handle herself. Her name was Belle Gunness. No, that's not the name she used on South California Street. That name, that infamous identity, belonged to a different time, a different city, a story we'll reserve for another episode. On South California Street, she was known as Mrs. Anna Smith, a widow of Norwegian descent, a woman in her late 30s with a strong build and a capable manner. She had arrived in Indianapolis in 1898, renting the property and immediately advertising for tenants. Those who met her found her unremarkable. She stood perhaps 5 feet 7 inches tall, solidly built from what appeared to be years of farm work. Her hair, light brown streaked with early gray, she wore pulled back in a practical bun. Her English carried a thick Scandinavian accent that made some words difficult to understand, but her meaning was usually clear enough. She preferred dark, practical dresses and kept her person meticulously clean, an important quality in a landlady prospective tenant's thought. She seemed particularly sympathetic to those in difficult circumstances. Elderly men living on small pensions found her rates reasonable. Workers temporarily between jobs discovered she could be patient about late rent if they explained their situations. She would cook occasional meals for those too ill or tired to prepare their own, bringing bowls of stew up the narrow stairs with what seemed like genuine kindness. She was a good woman, one former tenant later told investigators, his voice hollow with retrospective horror. Always asking if we needed anything, always concerned, but there were peculiarities, details that only gained significance in hindsight. Mrs. Smith preferred tenants who were alone in the world, single men without family in the city, elderly bachelors whose relatives lived in distant states, immigrants newly arrived who hadn't yet established connections. When interviewing prospective tenants, she would ask questions that seemed like small talk. Did they have family nearby? Did people know where they were staying? How often did they receive mail? She was insistent about the basement. No tenant was to go down there under any circumstances. She kept the door locked, carrying the only key on a cord around her neck. When asked why, she explained that the space was too dangerous, the stairs were unstable, the foundation had problems with water seepage, there were rats. She would handle any storage needs herself. Some tenants reported odd sounds at night. Digging, they thought, though the sounds were muffled and could have been many things. Once, a tenant named William Henderson came downstairs late at night for a drink of water and found Mrs. Smith emerging from the basement, her dress dirty, her hands covered in what looked like mud or clay. She had smiled and explained she'd been checking on a leak, but Henderson remembered the look in her eyes, startled, almost panicked, quickly concealed. Most significantly, tenants came and went with unusual frequency. A man would rent a room, stay for a few weeks or months, and then simply disappear. His belongings would vanish with him. When asked, Mrs. Smith would explain that he'd left, suddenly found work in another city, went to stay with relatives, moved on without notice, as transient workers often did. In a boarding house, in a city where people came and went constantly, this seemed unremarkable. The first official concern arose not from the police, but from a bank. In October of 1901, a bank officer named James Morton was reviewing dormant accounts when he noticed a peculiar pattern. 3 accounts, all belonging to elderly men, all showing regular small deposits from pensions or modest investments, had suddenly stopped showing any activity. The account holders had not withdrawn their funds, had not closed their accounts, had simply stopped. Morton Cross referenced the addresses. All 3 men had last been known to reside at 630 South California Street. He reported his findings to the Indianapolis Police Department, but the investigation that followed was cursory. A detective named Arthur Sullivan visited the boarding house, spoke with Mrs. Smith, and learned that all 3 men had left her establishment. One had mentioned going to live with a sister in Ohio. Another had spoken of returning to Pennsylvania. The third had simply departed without explanation, as was his right. Detective Sullivan noted that Mrs. Smith seemed cooperative and forthright. He closed the inquiry, but Morton remained troubled. Something about the pattern nagged at him. Elderly men with small incomes didn't typically abandon their bank accounts. In March of 1902, when a fourth account went dormant, this one belonging to a 58-year-old Swedish immigrant named Gustav Lindstrom Morton, pushed harder. This time, the police sent Detective Michael Hayes, a more thorough investigator who had developed a reputation for following his instincts. Hayes arrived at 630 South California Street on a gray afternoon in late March, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Mrs. Smith received him in the front parlor, offering coffee, which he declined. She sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, her expression pleasant and patient. "I'm inquiring about several former tenants," Hayes began, consulting his notebook. "A Mr. Lindstrom, who I understand stayed here until recently." "Ah, yes." Mrs. Smith nodded. "Gustav, nice man, very quiet. He left maybe 3 weeks ago." "Did he say where he was going?" "He mentioned going to Chicago. He had a cousin there, I think, or maybe it was Milwaukee. My English, you understand." She gestured apologetically. "And he left no forwarding address." "No. These men, they come and go. They don't always tell me everything." Hayes made notes. "What about Albert Crawford? He was here last year." "Crawford? Yes, I remember him. Older gentleman. He left in the summer. Said something about going back east." "And John Morrison, Peter Jorgensen." Mrs. Smith's expression remained placid, though Hayes noticed her hands had tightened slightly in her lap. "So many tenants over the years, Detective. I try to remember them all, but—" Hayes left with promises that he would investigate further, but Mrs. Smith's apparent cooperation and the lack of any concrete evidence of wrongdoing meant the case remained low priority. People disappeared in cities all the time, especially transient workers and elderly pensioners. Without bodies, without crime scenes, without grieving families demanding action, the police had more pressing matters. But Hayes couldn't shake his unease. He began making inquiries among neighbors, other boarding house operators, workers in the area. A pattern emerged. A factory foreman mentioned that one of his best workers, a man named Thomas Kelly, had left the city suddenly last year. Kelly had been staying at a boarding house on South California Street. He couldn't remember the number, but he thought it was in the 600s. A church pastor recalled an elderly parishioner, Ernst Hoffman, who had stopped attending services in the fall of 1900. Hoffman had been devoted, never missing a Sunday until he simply vanished. Someone said he'd been living in a boarding house nearby. A postal clerk mentioned that mail for several addresses on South California Street was often returned unclaimed, the intended recipients having apparently moved without filing forward. Information. This happened occasionally, but not with the frequency he'd noticed for one particular address. 630 South California Street. By May of 1902, Detective Hayes had compiled a list of 14 men who had last been known to reside at Mrs. Smith's boarding house and who had subsequently vanished without trace. 14 men who had left no forwarding addresses, who had abandoned bank accounts, who had severed all connections with employers, churches, and acquaintances. 14 men who had, quite simply, ceased to exist. Hayes brought his findings to his superior, Captain Theodore Walker, in early June. Walker, a pragmatic man more concerned with solving actual crimes than investigating missing persons cases involving transient workers, was initially dismissive. "These men are drifters, Hayes. They move on. That's what drifters do. 14 men, Captain, all from the same boarding house, all leaving behind money and possessions." "You said," the landlady explained, "that they took their possessions with them." "That's what she claims, but no one saw any of them leave with luggage. No one saw them hire carts or carriages. They just disappeared. Walker studied the list Hayes had compiled. 14 names, with dates of disappearance ranging from 1899 to 1902. The pattern was undeniable, but pattern wasn't proof. What are you suggesting that this woman is? What, murdering her tenants? When spoken aloud, it sounded absurd. Women didn't commit serial murder. Landladies didn't kill their paying customers. The idea violated every assumption about female nature, about rational self-interest, about the basic order of civilized society. But Hayes nodded slowly. "I think we need to search that house, Captain, thoroughly." Walker agreed to request a search warrant, though he clearly considered it a waste of resources that would ultimately embarrass the department. A judge, persuaded by the list of missing men and the bank accounts anomaly, granted the warrant on June 12, 1902. The search was scheduled for June 14th, a Saturday, chosen so that Hayes could bring additional officers without pulling them from regular duties. He assembled a team of 6 men, including Detective Sullivan, who had conducted the initial cursory investigation and now felt a gnawing guilt about what he might have missed. They arrived at 630 South California Street at 8 o'clock in the morning. Mrs. Smith answered the door dressed for the day. Unsurprised, Hayes had informed her of the search warrant the previous evening as a courtesy. "Of course, Detective," she said calmly, "search wherever you like. I have nothing to hide." She stood in the parlor, hands folded, expression serene, while the officers spread through the house. They searched the tenant rooms, finding modest furniture and the personal belongings of current residents who had been asked to vacate for the day. They searched Mrs. Smith's private quarters, finding nothing unusual: clothing, personal items, account books that appeared meticulous and ordinary. They searched the kitchen, the pantry, the outbuildings. Finally, Detective Hayes stood before the basement door. It was locked, as always. Mrs. Smith produced the key from the cord around her neck, handed it to him without hesitation. "The stairs are dangerous," she warned. "I have been meaning to repair them." Hayes unlocked the door. Stale air wafted up from the darkness below, carrying the smell of damp earth and something else, something organic and unsettling that he couldn't quite identify. He lit a lantern and descended. The basement was larger than he'd expected, extending under the entire footprint of the house. The ceiling was low, supported by thick wooden posts. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and marked with depressions and mounds. Cobwebs stretched across the corners. Old furniture and crates lined the walls. Hayes moved slowly through the space, his lantern casting wild shadows. Detective Sullivan followed, and then Officer Patrick O'Brien, a young patrolman on his first major investigation. "What are we looking for?" Sullivan asked quietly. "I don't know," Hayes admitted. "Anything unusual, disturbed earth, recent digging." They searched for nearly an hour, finding nothing conclusive. The basement appeared to be exactly what Mrs. Smith claimed: a storage space, damp and unpleasant, filled with the accumulated debris of years. Hayes was about to give up, about to admit that his instincts had led him astray, when Officer O'Brien called out from the far corner, "Detective, there's something odd here." Hayes and Sullivan hurried over. O'Brien was standing near the northeast corner of the basement, where the lantern light barely reached. He pointed at the ground. "Look at the soil. It's different here, darker, softer." Hayes knelt, pressing his hand against the earth. O'Brien was right. The soil here was noticeably different from the hard, packed clay that covered most of the basement floor. This dirt was loose, recently disturbed, though an attempt had been made to compact it. "Get shovels," Hayes ordered. They dug, 6 inches down, the shovel struck something solid but yielding. Not rock, not wood, something else. Hayes cleared the dirt away carefully with his hands. His fingers touched fabric rotted, stained, wrapped around something. A bone, a human femur, still partially clothed in the remnants of trousers. Hayes sat back on his heels, his heart pounding. Get everyone down here, and someone go arrest Mrs. Smith before she tries to leave. But when Officer Sullivan rushed upstairs, he found Mrs. Smith exactly where they had left her, sitting calmly in the parlor, her hands still folded, her expression unchanged. "You found them," she said. It wasn't a question. What followed was one of the most gruesome excavations in Indianapolis history. For 3 days, police officers and hired laborers dug through the basement of 630 South California Street, carefully extracting human remains from the packed earth. The bodies, or what remained of them, had been buried in no particular pattern. Some were stacked atop each other in crude mass graves. Others occupied individual plots barely large enough to contain a human form. All had been buried without coffins, wrapped only in bed sheets or cheap blankets that had rotted away to fragments. The first complete skeleton they extracted belonged to a man of perhaps 60 years, buried approximately 3 feet deep. His skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma, a depression above the left temple that would have been instantly fatal. Scraps of clothing suggested he had been a manual laborer. A corroded pocket watch found near the remains bore the initials G. L. Gustav Lindstrom, the man whose dormant bank account had triggered the investigation just 3 months earlier. The second body was less intact, having been buried longer. The skeleton showed the fragile bones of an elderly man, perhaps 70 or more. The skull was intact, showing no obvious injury, suggesting death by poison or suffocation. A wedding ring on the bone finger bore an inscription too worn to read. The third, the fourth, the fifth. By the end of the first day, they had unearthed 7 bodies. By the end of the second day, 17. The excavation became a public spectacle. Despite police efforts to cordon off the street, crowds gathered, pressing against the barriers, craning for glimpses of the horror unfolding in the basement. Newspaper reporters fought for positions, their accounts growing more lurid with each edition. "House of Death yields its secrets," proclaimed the Indianapolis News. "Landlady's Chamber of Horrors," screamed the Indianapolis Star. Inside the basement, the work continued under the harsh glare of electric lights that the city had strung into the space. Detective Hayes supervised the excavation personally, documenting each discovery, trying to identify each victim from the scraps of evidence they left behind. The bodies told stories. A man buried with his boots still on, suggesting he had been killed suddenly, without warning. Another whose skeleton showed evidence of restraints marks on the wrist bones, suggesting he had been tied before death. A third whose position in the grave suggested he had been alive when buried, his bones twisted in a final, futile struggle against suffocating earth. The basement floor, once they had excavated all the shallow graves, revealed evidence of even older burials. Deeper graves, where bodies had decomposed completely, leaving only stains in the soil and occasional fragments of bone. How many more victims might there have been? How long had this horror been continuing? By the evening of June 17th, the excavation was complete. 23 bodies had been recovered. 23 men who had come to 630 South California Street seeking shelter and had found only death. The coroner, Dr. William Harrison, supervised the examination of the remains. His preliminary findings were chilling. Of the 23 victims, 8 showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull bludgeoned to death. likely while sleeping or otherwise vulnerable. 4 showed signs of strangulation, crushed larynxes, fractured hyoid bones. The remaining 11 showed no obvious cause of death, suggesting poison, suffocation with a pillow, or other methods that left no skeletal evidence. The victims ranged in age from approximately 40 to 75 years. All were male. All appeared to have been manual laborers or elderly pensioners, men of modest means, men without families close by, men who wouldn't be immediately missed. The methodical nature of the murders suggested careful planning. Mrs. Smith, if that was indeed her real name, had been selecting her victims with precision. She had been killing for years, perfecting her methods, disposing of bodies in the space beneath her tenants' feet. Mrs. Anna Smith, the woman the press would eventually identify as Belle Gunness, though that revelation would come later, was arrested on June 14th, immediately after the discovery of the first body. She was transported to the Marion County Jail and held without bail. Her interrogation began that same evening, conducted by Detective Hayes and Captain Walker in a windowless room lit by a single gas lamp. She sat calmly in a wooden chair, her hands resting on the table, her expression composed. "Tell us about the men in your basement," Hayes began. "What would you like to know?" Her calm was unnerving. She showed no fear, no remorse, no anxiety. She might have been discussing the weather. "Did you kill them?" "Yes." The simple admission hung in the air. Hayes and Walker exchanged glances. Suspects didn't typically confess this readily, especially not to serial murder. "How many?" Walker asked. She considered the question. "I'm not certain. 20. 3 you said you found. That sounds approximately correct. Why?" For the first time, something flickered across her face, not quite emotion, but perhaps the shadow of thought. "Because they had money," she said finally, "small amounts, but enough, and because they were alone. No one cared about them. No one would look for them." Over the following days, investigators extracted more details. Mrs. Smith, the woman who had also used the names Bella Paulson, Jenny Olson, and eventually Belle Gunness, described her methodology with disturbing clarity. She would select tenants carefully, interviewing them extensively to determine their circumstances. Did they have family? How much money did they have? Were they in good health? Would anyone notice if they disappeared? Once a suitable victim was installed in the house, she would wait for the right moment. Some she killed within weeks. Others she allowed to stay for months, extracting rent money before finally deciding they had outlived their usefulness. Her methods varied. For younger, stronger men, she preferred poison chloral hydrate slipped into their evening meals, enough to make them drowsy and confused. Once they were incapacitated, she would smother them with pillows or strangle them with a rope. For elderly victims, the process was simpler. A blow to the head while they slept, quick and efficient. After death, she would drag the bodies to the basement, a task she managed despite her victims often outweighing her. She was strong from years of farm work, and dead weight becomes manageable when one knows how to leverage it. She would bury them in the darkness, under cover of night, when no tenants were likely to be awake. The sounds of digging that some tenants reported hearing, those were the sounds of graves being prepared, of earth being moved to conceal murder. She would then dispose of the victims' belongings, burning clothing, selling valuables, keeping cash. She would tell other tenants that the man had left, moved on, gone elsewhere. In a boarding house where people came and went constantly, no one questioned these departures. The total financial gain was modest. Investigators estimated she had accumulated perhaps $3,000 over 4 years. Money taken from victims' pockets, pensions cashed fraudulently, small bank accounts accessed through. Forged documents, for this amount, 20. 3 men had died. Did you feel anything? Hayes asked during one interrogation. When you killed them, any remorse, any hesitation? She looked at him blankly. They were going to die anyway. She said, old men, sick men, men with no purpose. I simply hastened things and made use of what they left behind. The complete absence of empathy in her voice chilled everyone who heard it. Here was a woman who viewed human beings as resources to be exploited, obstacles to be removed, sources of income to be harvested. She had killed not in passion or anger, but with the cold calculation of a predator culling prey. The trial of Anna Smith began in September of 1902 in the Marion County Courthouse. The proceedings drew massive public attention, with crowds lining up hours before the courthouse opened each day, hoping for seats in the gallery. The prosecution was led by District Attorney John Merrick, a veteran prosecutor known for his methodical preparation. The defense fell to Albert Weston, a public defender who had drawn what many considered an impossible assignment, defending a woman who had confessed to 23 murders. Weston's strategy was to argue insanity. He brought expert witnesses who testified about female hysteria, about the mental instability that could result from years of poverty and hardship, about the possibility that his client suffered from moral insanity, a condition that left her unable to distinguish right from wrong. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Detective Hayes testified about the investigation, the excavation, the bodies found buried beneath the boarding house. Dr. Harrison presented the coroner's findings, describing in clinical detail the methods of death. Bank officials testified about the dormant accounts, the forged signatures, the systematic theft. And then the prosecution called Mrs. Smith herself to the stand. She testified for 3 days, describing her crimes with the same calm detachment she had shown during interrogation. The jury sat transfixed as she explained how she selected victims, how she killed them, how she buried them. She showed no emotion as she recounted specific murders: the elderly man who had begged for his life before she smothered him, the worker who had trusted her enough to drink the poisoned coffee she offered, the pensioner who never woke from his final sleep. Mrs. Smith, Merrick asked during cross-examination, "Do you understand that what you did was wrong?" She considered the question carefully. "I understand that the law says it was wrong," she replied, "but I don't feel that it was wrong. They were weak. I was strong. That's how nature works." This answer, perhaps more than anything else, sealed her fate. The defense's insanity plea crumbled in the face of such rational, articulate amorality. She wasn't insane. She was simply evil, operating by a moral code that placed her own survival and comfort above all human life. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on 23 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, a stern-faced man named Harold Mitchell, who had presided over many criminal trials, but nothing approaching this scale of horror, delivered the sentence with visible anger in his voice. "Mrs. Smith, or whatever your true name may be, you have been found guilty of crimes so heinous, so devoid of human compassion, that this court struggles to find precedent in our civilized society. You murdered 23 men, 23 souls who trusted you, who sought only shelter and found death. You did this not in madness, not in passion, but with cold premeditation and calculation. You showed no mercy to your victims and shall receive none from this court. I hereby sentence you to death by hanging, said execution to be carried out on December 5th, 1902. May God have mercy on your soul, for I have none to give." Mrs. Smith received the sentence without visible reaction. She simply nodded, as if confirming a business transaction. Mrs. Anna Smith was hanged at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City on December 5, 1902. She was 43 years old, making her one of the few women executed in Indiana history. Witnesses reported that she walked to the gallows without assistance, her face composed, her steps steady. She declined the offer of a hood. She spoke no final words. When the trapdoor opened, she dropped through, and the rope did its work efficiently. Death was pronounced after 11 minutes. The boarding house at 630 South California Street was demolished in January of 1903. The city condemned the structure, and workers tore it down brick by brick, filling in the basement with clean earth and paving over the site. Today, a parking lot occupies the space, and few who park there know the horror that once unfolded beneath their feet. The identification of victims proved challenging. Of the 23 bodies, investigators managed to positively identify only 14. The remaining 9 were eventually buried in unmarked graves in Crown Hill Cemetery, their names lost to time. Bank accounts were settled, money returned to distant relatives where possible. The $3,000 that Mrs. Smith had accumulated was used to cover the costs of investigation, trial, and burial. Nothing remained for compensation to the families of her victims. As for Mrs. Smith's true identity, the investigation revealed a disturbing truth. She was indeed Belle Gunness, a name that would become infamous in American criminal history. Born Brynhild Paulstatter Storseth in Selbu, Norway, in 1859, she had immigrated to America in 1881. Her life before arriving in Indianapolis had been marked by suspicious deaths, a husband in Chicago who died when a sausage grinder fell on his head, children who perished in fires, insurance claims. That always seemed to benefit Belle. Indianapolis was merely one stop in a killing spree that may have claimed 50 or more victims over 2 decades. After her execution, historians and criminologists would discover other properties she had owned, other cities where she had lived, other mysterious disappearances. But on South California Street, 3 men had met their end. 3 lives cut short for modest financial gain. 3 souls who came seeking shelter and found only death in the darkness of a landlady's basement. The story of Belle Gunness and the boarding house at 630 South California Street remains a disturbing reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. It can wear a pleasant face, speak in a kind voice, offer shelter to the vulnerable and weary. The men who climbed the steps to her door had no way of knowing that their landlady viewed them not as human beings, but as resources to be exploited, lives to be harvested. This case challenged many assumptions of its time. Women were supposed to be the gentler sex, incapable of such calculated violence. Landladies were supposed to be maternal figures, protectors of their tenants. The idea that a woman could systematically murder dozens of men over years shocked the public consciousness and forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about human nature. But questions remain, mysteries that haunt even now. How many victims were there really? The 23 found in Indianapolis represent only what was discovered in one location during one investigation. Belle had owned properties in Chicago, in Indiana farmland, in other cities. How many more bodies might lie undiscovered in forgotten basements, buried beneath buildings long since demolished? And perhaps most troubling, how many victims could have been saved if someone had acted sooner? If Detective Sullivan had been more thorough during his first investigation? If tenants had reported their suspicions more forcefully instead of dismissing odd sounds as rats and imagination? If society had been willing to consider that her respectable, seeming landlady might be capable of monstrous acts. The case also raises questions about who we choose to care about as a society. Belle's victims were predominantly elderly men, immigrants, transient workers, people living on the margins, people without strong family connections, people who wouldn't be immediately missed. Their disappearances went uninvestigated for years, partly because their lives were deemed less valuable, less worthy of attention and resources. To this day, the site of the boarding house carries a reputation. The parking lot at 630 South California Street is said to feel colder than surrounding areas, even on hot summer days. Some report feeling watched when they walk through the space. Others claim to hear sounds, faint scraping, like shovels against earth, when the street is quiet at night. Are these genuine supernatural phenomena, or simply the power of knowing the history of a place? Perhaps it doesn't matter. The psychological weight of knowing that 23 men died brutally in that spot, that their bodies were stacked in the darkness while life continued normally above them, creates its own kind of haunting. If this journey through one of Indianapolis's darkest chapters has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the nature of evil and the vulnerability of those who live on society's margins, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined, horrors that history tried to forget but which we must remember. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on how we as a society protect, or fail to protect, the vulnerable among us. How do we balance the desire to trust with the need for vigilance? How do we ensure that those without families or resources are not forgotten when they disappear? The story of Belle Gunness and her victims reminds us that every life has value, that every disappearance deserves investigation, that we must remain alert to evil even when it wears a kind face. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters are not those in folklore or imagination, but those who walk among us, hiding in plain sight.